title of this video is Problematization. Problematization is a way of looking for problems in the world that looks a little bit deeper than the surface. Oftentimes when you're looking at a paper, you are looking at the tip of the iceberg. There may be assumptions underpinning what is written in the paper, and if you're able to get to those assumptions and dig deep, you may find that it's actually something very valuable underneath. Now, there are 9 ways of thinking about elements of thought. There's a point of view, a purpose, a question, there's information, interpretation, concepts, and implications and consequences. But it's the assumptions that are really the target of problematization. Now, everybody wants to produce work that's interesting, work that's influential. I did a study of influential work and they found that challenging the assumptions allows theories to become the most significant. If you look at Einstein, he challenged assumptions constantly through his thought experiments, and that's partly why his work became so famous. Now, you can't, as I've said previously, just bomb all your readers' assumptions out of the water. You need to agree with them to some extent, otherwise it may be such a shock to them that they just disregard your paper and won't read it. But identifying the assumptions, finding what you agree with, finding what you disagree with, can then allow a new way of thinking to emerge. Let's look at some of the ways in which problematization can occur. Well, the aim of problematization is generating novel research questions through identifying the assumptions and challenging the assumptions and continuing the conversation. To say that a discipline a discipline is based on a number of assumptions, it reaches a certain point, but if you can change one of the fundamental tenets underpinning a discipline, you can open up huge areas for new work. So there's various ways that problematization papers have been categorized. There can be paradigm shifts, you might have heard of those. There can be assumptions that a particular field might hold. There can be metaphors that underpin work. There can be a few ways in which the thinking and the ideas in a film can be there's a few ways that the thinking in a field can be underpinned. How can you identify and challenge these assumptions? Well, you can identify a domain of literature, what actually defines that domain. You can look at assumptions in that literature, evaluate where they've been articulated. Is there something there that is worth being challenged? If it is, try a variation on a theme. What might the audience find interesting? And then evaluate that alternative. Do some work in that space. See where it leads. You may come up with something that is really powerful, helpful, and influential. You might change the way a whole discipline thinks about itself. The way to do this is to continue the conversation to some extent. Do not read a paper thinking that this is the last word on the subject. Nobody else can say anything about it. It's closed. It's finished. That's not how it works. Somebody says a technique is bad. Well, think about when it could be good. Somebody else says this method is good. Well, think about when it could be bad. You can always find situations if you think creatively enough as to when something might work or might not work. Here's a couple of examples. Somebody recognised that finding prime numbers, the factors in primes, is really difficult. When could it be useful? Well, it's now the foundation of financial cryptography. Somebody else recognised that optical character recognition is hard. They also turned that problem on its head, and now we have captures for determining whether a person is using a website or a computer. Here's an example of somebody who challenged assumptions. In the previous video, we talked about getting the absolute barest minimum information across in a chart, and we talked about chart junk. Getting rid of colours, getting rid of lines, getting rid of this, getting rid of that. Now, at first blush, this picture seems like it's absolutely loaded with chart junk. How much unnecessary information could you get rid of in that? But let's have another look and another think about chart junk. What are the pros and cons? Well, the pros, it's certainly more memorable than a flat graph. It's more engaging. You might not have it in a scientific or an engineering paper, but you certainly might have it in a popular article. It's far more memorable than the dry graphs that we talked about before. So it challenges the assumptions that getting the message across is all that you want. If you want somebody to remember the message, then that's a different story. Well, what are the cons of it? It's not very efficient in terms of space. It's a bit hard to look at it. Do you trust it? How do you know how unbiased it is? There's no error bars. But nevertheless, it challenges the assumption that getting the minimum information over the page is all that producing charts is about.